Before the rise of Caesar Augustus, before Alexander the Great's conquests throughout the known world, before Cyrus established the great Persian Empire, there was Nebuchadnezzar's Babylonian Empire. And under his father, Nabopolassar, the Neo-Babylonian period began. But it was Nebuchadnezzar who really elevated Babylon to its unparalleled place and prominent position in world history. And last week, we began to consider this as we introduced the book of Daniel. We began to see some of the historical details there as they interwove with the historical significance, not just of the book, but also of the prophecies contained in this book. And what we're reading about here in this first chapter is a moment that is pivotal in Israel's history. It's a shift from how God had been dealing with the world in world history to how God is dealing with it today. There is something that is happening in the book of Daniel that is very akin to what is happening today. What do I mean by that? This is the beginning of Gentile dominance in world history. This is a time of prophetic transition that Jesus refers to in Luke 21:24 as the time of the Gentiles. This period inaugurated or is inaugurated by Judah's captivity by Babylon. It's exile there. And it signifies God temporarily setting aside Israel as his primary conduit of his redemptive program due to the people's covenant unfaithfulness. And he said he would do this in Deuteronomy 28. He said this would happen if you are unfaithful. And this begins a sequence of Gentile empires, which we even read about right here in the book of Daniel. And it starts with the Babylonian Empire, but then it moves on to the Medo-Persian Empire. And then moves on into the Grecian Empire under Alexander the Great and beyond. And then finally that gives way to the Roman Empire. All of these empires will continue to dominate. And of course, Europe has continued to dominate in a sense. What is left of the Roman Empire has continued to dominate and will continue to dominate until the return of Christ. Now, there are some Christians, of course, who disagree here, but we believe Scripture is pointing us to the fact that time is going to culminate in a future tribulation period. A time of worldwide upheaval that will then be the establishment of Christ's millennial kingdom, his 1,000-year reign, in which Israel will finally be restored. Not as an unbelieving nation, but as a believing one. Gentile rule will end as Christ is ruling there, as a stone which is cut out without hands, as Daniel 2 talks about, comes and crushes Gentile dominance. You say, what about those of us who are Gentiles? Well, guess what? We are grafted into the promises Romans 11 says. We are brought near. We are brought near. And we're grafted in. And we'll talk about all of that when the time comes. I'm still in many ways giving you an introduction to the book of Daniel. And this, of course, being the opening verses of Daniel, is still very introductory. And what we're seeing here is something that is perhaps more historical, of course, than prophetic. This is something that has already happened, and it is something that is telling us what God did as a result of Israel's unfaithfulness at that time. And yet there is still something here that we can receive because we are God's people today. And as God's people, we face a similar situation. Just as the youths were taken from Israel, from Judah to be more precise, into this pagan land, so too we also, being converted in a pagan land, must learn how to live here as God's people, as believers. And we can learn. We can be faithful, even in a pagan land. And so we're going to be exploring features this evening of what life in a pagan land is like. Sometimes a pagan land abducts young people, verses 1 and 2. That's certainly true here, certainly true there. Sometimes a pagan land re-educates youths, verses 3 and 4. True here, true there. A pagan land sometimes conditions youths, verses 5 through 7. And yet, as we consider these things, I don't want you to be depressed. I don't want you to feel downcast or disheartened, because what we will see, not only in this passage, but throughout the book of Daniel, is God's sovereignty throughout all of this. He is over all. He is over all, and he is making sure that his people will be provided for. They will have what they need in the midst of this land. Let's see that as we get into the first point. First, a pagan land sometimes abducts young people, verses 1 and 2. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. Well, these verses here, again, set the historical context for the whole book, for everything that happens in this book. How does Daniel get to Babylon? What is going on? Where does Babylon come from? This is setting the stage here. And now, if you have read, maybe you have read in your Bible reading in the book of 2 Kings, you may have already anticipated some of this. Particularly this. There was a wicked king, King Jehoiakim, who ruled Judah at that time. And he was installed, surprisingly enough, by a Pharaoh, Pharaoh Necho, after the Pharaoh had defeated King Josiah at Megiddo. So Josiah was seeking help from the Assyrians, and the Pharaoh defeated him. This is in 2 Kings 23, and you can see that in verses 29 through 34. He installs Jehoiakim. He names Jehoiakim. And that just shows that Egypt now has power over the king of Judah. Think about the circle that is being drawn right there between the book of Exodus and the end of 2 Kings. Here we have the Pharaoh again having power over the people of God. Now, Jehoiakim was a wicked king, and he did not seem to mind this that much. In fact, as Jeremiah would be approaching him, and maybe you recognize him from the book of Jeremiah, Jeremiah would speak to him and tell him about the impending judgment that is coming. He did not like that. He had Jeremiah imprisoned. You might remember at one point he has Jeremiah's prophecies read and then burned. They would just cut the section out and then burn it in the fire. And then they would read another section and cut it out and burn it in the fire. Guess what? That doesn't stop God's judgment. That only increases God's judgment. It doesn't stop it, though. And so Second Chronicles also records this, Second Chronicles 36. And Jehoiakim found himself serving Nebuchadnezzar nonetheless for 3 years until he rebelled. And that, of course, sealed his fate. Now, who is Nebuchadnezzar? Again, he would become king of Babylon. You might remember him if you studied world history. This is one of the big names of world history. And he became king of Babylon after his father's death in 605 BC. That was a very eventful year, especially for us who are trying to follow these things in Scripture. As the crown prince that year, he defeated the Egyptians at Carchemish. And then he swiftly asserted Babylonian dominance over the region, over northern Syria, as well as Judah. And so it is in that year that he besieges Jerusalem. And that means that he sends his army. They set siege around the city. Jehoiakim has no choice but to become a vassal of the state. The Babylonian Chronicles record that Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to Jerusalem. It records a later siege in 597. Of course, there were 3 sieges in 605, 597, and 587. 587. And extra biblical sources also confirm Nebuchadnezzar's first siege in 605. You might say, well, that's a lot of dates that you're throwing out. The point is that he kept coming back to humble Jehoiakim, and then finally, of course, he puts out Jehoiakim's eyes and takes him captive. In that second siege, I believe that happened, and he takes the youths, including Ezekiel, in that one. And then in 587, he finally flattens Jerusalem. But it was 605 that marked the start of the Babylonian exile, and that's the date really that is being highlighted here in verse 1, in the 3rd year of the reign. And it's during that year that he took those captives, Babylonian records, as well as a historian, Berosus, I believe his name is pronounced, confirmed the fact that he took Jewish captives during this campaign. And so this is when he took his first wave of captives. Now, there is a little bit of a question. Some wonder, okay, maybe Daniel has his dates wrong, because Daniel says it's during the 3rd year. However, in Jeremiah, it says it's during the 4th year of Jehoiakim. So maybe Daniel doesn't know what he's talking about. Well, this is just a difference of Babylonian records versus the records that they would have had in Judah. The Babylonians had a spring calendar. The Judeans had a fall calendar. And the events between what would have been Nisan and Tishri on the Judean calendar fell within Jehoiakim's 4th year by the Babylonian reckoning, but the 3rd year by the Judean standards. And so that's why there is a little bit of a discrepancy. But we do see these kinds of things every once in a while when we're trying to match up dates. Even in the books of 1st Kings and 2nd Kings, we have a little bit of a problem sometimes because Israel to the north used a different calendar than Judah to the south. And so it's a little bit of a struggle if you want to try to match up all those numbers, all those dates. It can be a trial if you've ever tried to do that because you have to take into account that some of them will start the year here, some of them will start the year here, some of them will count a king's ascension the 1st year that he is in power, and some count it at the end of the 1st year that he is in power. And that creates a problem as we try to reconcile all of that together. But that said, there's not really any real reason to doubt the dates or the facts of these events. Just because one person uses one calendar and another person uses another calendar is no evidence that there is anything amiss here. That just is a fact of the time period. But the Babylonians would have seen the conquest of Jerusalem as a victory, not just militarily, but spiritually. What do I mean by that? They would have seen this as a victory over the God of Israel. And this is what you see sometimes when there were battles. Whoever won the battle, it's not just, oh, you had a superior military strategy. No, it was, oh, your God is more powerful. That was the idea. It was a battle of the gods. They would have seen it as a victory of their gods. But what is the real reason for the subjugation of Jehoiakim? Verse 2 says it. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. And it's said twice, right? Look, verse 1 says Jehoiakim is the king of Judah. Verse 2 says that Jehoiakim is the king of Judah. God is making sure that you understand that this is his will. He is turning over the king. He is doing it as judgment. God remains in control, even in these dark times. And that's what we're seeing here. The term that's used here is Lord. Now, sometimes we've had discussions, okay, what kind of Lord are we talking about here? Is it the capital L, lowercase O-R-D, or is it the capital L, small cap O-R-D? Well, this is just capital L, lowercase O-R-D. That is the translation for the Hebrew word Adonai. Adonai. And so what we have here is not the covenant name of God, but rather the name of God that is utilized when we want to talk about his sovereignty, his power, his kingship. He is Lord. He is Adonai. He is the one who is over the affairs, not just of us, but over the affairs of kings, because he is the King of kings and Lord of lords. And this is the Lord who is giving up this one king, according to his will, to the hand of another king. Isaiah 42:24 says this: Who gave Jacob up for spoil and Israel to plunderers? Was it not the Lord against whom we have sinned? The Lord gave them up. The Lord gave up King Jehoiakim. The Lord is over these affairs, and he is the one who has determined and decreed this is going to happen. Nebuchadnezzar is going to come in here. He is going to have the victory, and the Lord is the one who gave him the victory. Nebuchadnezzar's victory was not due to his own military prowess. It was due to God's sovereign judgment on Judah's sin. We'll see other instances of the Lord's control later in this chapter, but he is in control. And this is scary as we think about this. God takes sin seriously. And if we continue to just go through the motions, God will judge sin eventually. And that is exactly what we see in this text. God not only gave Jehoiakim over, but he allowed Nebuchadnezzar to take some of the vessels of the house of God. Now, this is stunning. But the Hebrew here, by the way, we could literally render this the God. And, like it's definitive. We could have it with a definite article there. I think that is to set it apart from Nebuchadnezzar's gods, which are mentioned here in this chapter. Perhaps it's Marduk or Bel here, but whoever the Babylonian deities are, there is a contrast between them, little g gods in our English translations, and the capital G, the God that is mentioned here. The vessels will be taken to the house of his God, Nebuchadnezzar's God, but here we have them being taken from the house of the God. Do you think Nebuchadnezzar had the power to just do that? To just pull that off? And the answer is no. No, he did not. This is something that God is allowing. Even though Nebuchadnezzar, of course, in his ignorance and in his pride and arrogance, perhaps, is counting this right now as a victory of his gods. He doesn't know. He will know. It will be explained to him later on. That these elements are taken, they're placed in the treasury, the pagan shrine, as an act of Babylon's perceived triumph over Israel's God. Later on, we'll see a wicked act where they are brought back out for a drunken party by Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. We'll see how that goes when we get there. Of course, many of you already know that story. But here we are seeing the truth that, or we who are seeing the truth understand here, that it is all happening according to the permissive will of God. This is something that God is allowing to happen. And of course, this is something that God has decreed will happen. Now, this includes, of course, the abduction of people. And this is a dark reality. Pagan societies engage in this. They abduct things. They may even steal. It's surprising to me. It used to be that criminals were a little bit more superstitious. They wouldn't break into churches and steal things, but that does happen now. They steal things from church property. They break in. They steal things from inside of churches. That is a sign that our society is certainly slipping a little bit. And then the abduction of people. That has happened throughout world history, and it happens today. There are people who target young people, the vulnerable, maybe through conscription to go into an army, and we see that sometimes in African nations, third world nations, human trafficking, which happens in lots of places, South America, Central America, happens here too. And there is definitely human trafficking happening here, and there is, of course, ideological capture. Just a few years ago, who was it? The San Francisco Gay Men's Choir sang a whole song, "We're Coming for Your Children." And they just thought that was really funny to say, "We're coming for your children. We're going to convert them." A lot of those individuals have been arrested for child pornography and different things like that. I think they meant it in a very literal sense, some of them, as they sang that song, "We're coming for your children." Thankfully, a lot of them have either died from AIDS or have been arrested. But this is not just there within San Francisco or something like that, or within a small enclave. No, there is an ideological capture happening within our schools right now. And children are facing pressures from secular education and from cultural activism to pull them away from the faith. It happens not just in school, it happens on social media. All social media sites can be a driving force for this. Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, all of the major social media sites, YouTube, et cetera, all of these can be places for that, hubs for that. Reddit and different places like that have different areas of activism like that are seeking to do this. There is a 24/7 calling of children that is being waged by certain individuals. And but when I say certain individuals, I mean some, not all. Obviously, there are some people who are not doing this, but there are some who are. There are some who are. And we need to be aware of that. That is a sign of a pagan culture, and it does happen. And when we see that, we may be tempted to be discouraged. But Daniel 1 2 here reminds us that even though God may be silent in this, and even though God may be allowing some things to happen, that does not mean that God is absent. And that does not mean that God is not in control. And there are certain things that God is getting ready for and storing up judgment for. Babylon eventually will face judgment for what happens here. Babylon does not stay in world history as a world power. It gets replaced, and it gets replaced very violently, as do the other empires. God does bring judgment, but sometimes also that means that God brings judgment against his people. So we have to be faithful in what God has called us to. And hopefully our faithfulness will be a message to the pagan society around us. Speaking of that pagan society, we said that it sometimes abducts youth. Sometimes it also re-educates them. Sometimes it also re-educates them. Verses 3 through 4, we see that. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of his officials, to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of the nobles, youths in whom there was no defect, who were good looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, who had ability for serving in the king's court. And he ordered him to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. Among the captured youths, or among the captured would be youths, excuse me, to serve in Babylon's purposes. I'm just trying so hard not to say youths, because that is kind of more of my my inflection there. But the youths, Nebuchadnezzar wants them so that they are educated according to what Babylon teaches, so that he can then turn around and use them. And that's why he commands Ashpenaz, the chief of his officials, to select from the captives of Israel's elite. And among those who would be chosen, of course, would be Daniel and his three friends. Now, there's some question as to what would first happen with these youths. And that is because the term for officials here in verse 3 can mean eunuch, and some translations do have that as eunuch, that he is the chief of the eunuchs. And that is certainly what would happen in many ancient courts. There would be eunuchs. And so the assumption that a lot of people have had is that if he is over these youths and he is the chief of the eunuchs, then all of the youths would have faced castration. And that is kind of the assumption that a lot of people have taken. And I will say that's, of course, possible. But there is no mention of this in the text. And that, of course, would be a violation if it had happened. And perhaps the text is wanting to shield us from that thought. But the term also denotes just a trusted official. It doesn't necessarily mean eunuch. And we could think of the term in places like Genesis 37:36, where we see that Potiphar was a trusted official or an official of Pharaoh, and he had a wife. So it does not necessarily mean one who has been castrated. And considering that castration was forbidden by the law of Moses, and Daniel takes a moral stand later on what we might consider by comparison a lesser issue in this chapter. Well, it's unlikely, and in my mind, at least at this point, that they were made eunuchs. They probably were not at this point. But Daniel and his three friends would be facing re-education, education and re-education. Now, of course, they would have already known some education, especially if they were not just of the sons of Israel, but also of the royal family and the nobles, which is very likely. Um, and so they may have already known the Hebrew language, of course. They would have known the law. They may have already known some of the language of the day, which was Aramaic. And they may have been from Jehoiakim's descendants or of his family. They may have been. And that, of course, would have fulfilled the prophecy that his descendants would be taken. Um, uh, of course, the prophecy would be fulfilled either way, but they may have been named participants in that fulfillment of the prophecy. So it's very likely that that is the case. Now, why are they going to be educated? Well, Nebuchadnezzar's strategy was a simple one, and it was a common one at that time. What they're going to do is take these youths from the conquered land, educate them for several years, typically 3 years, and then turn around and maybe some of them would serve in the royal court, and others would go back home. They would go back home, yes, but as mouthpieces, as people who have now been trained, who were a little bit more sympathetic to the king, and they could then weaken the resolve of their nation as they said, no, this isn't so bad. We were treated well by the king, and we need to obey the king. And so that would also strengthen Babylon. These were God's chosen people. Of the children of Israel, they are God's chosen people. They are now under Gentile rule, and they are living in an unbelieving world. The unbelieving world targets believing children. It does. Whether they're influential or not, they want to shape culture. The unbelieving world, I should say, wants to shape culture, and it wants to win the next generation. That's why everybody is going wild right now that a lot of Gen Z males are voting Republican, and that everyone's losing their mind over that. Why is this happening? What's going on? How have we lost them? And there certainly is a sense in which the Democratic line, the Democratic ideals, are very in line with what Satan would want for this world. That doesn't mean that the Republican line is much better, though. And there are certainly some things that we need to watch out for there as well. But today's universities and media seek to re-educate Christian youth. They want to replace biblical values with secular ideologies. Oh, you believe that abortion's wrong? Well, let me disabuse you of that notion. Oh, you believe that God exists? Well, let me give you all these proofs to show you that he doesn't exist, etc., etc., etc. That's why it's so important for parents to equip children to discern truth, whether through Christian education or just vigilant oversight. You know, it's great if we can do private education. It's great if we can do homeschooling. If you can't do either of those, though, you have to double down and make sure you know that your kids are not receiving some kind of education behind your backs, because that could very well be happening. And we do see that happening. In verse 4, we see that Babylon selected these youths, and they did so for this education program. But they had certain criteria. How old would these youths be? I'm using the word youth a lot. What is the age range that I'm referring to? This would have been someone who is roughly between 14 and 17 years of age. The idea there is that it's someone who is not exactly a child anymore, but someone who is still young enough to be teachable, moldable, malleable, someone who could be receptive to indoctrination. Who are these people that were to be chosen? Well, of that age range and of the families that have been selected here, they are first to be those who are without defect. That means they are to be physically perfect and presentable. If someone has, is born with, some kind of a birth defect, their hand may be a little disformed, or a foot that may be, misshapen. That person would be immediately out. You're looking for people who are just physically perfect as they are. This is also the same thing that God commanded for priests as they would sacrifice, because you don't want the priest to lift up an offering before the people and before God, and maybe there is a blemish on his hand, and that's what people notice. It needs to be someone who is without spot, as well as the sacrificial animals. And so the Babylonians were looking for the same thing in a sense here. But they weren't just looking for that. They were, because it's one thing to just have, all four limbs and to not necessarily have physical defects. They were second looking for people who are good looking. So they wanted people who were pleasant on the eyes, young men who were not necessarily bad to look at, I guess you could say. It is very much like the elite, or how the elite might choose some today for influence. You don't typically put people in Hollywood blockbuster movies, for instance, who are unattractive. And that's because the idea is that beauty or handsomeness sells tickets. And that's the idea there. Of course, there's something very worldly about that thinking, and that is why the world uses it, including Babylon. Third, they were to also be intelligent and discerning. It's funny how this is third and not first. They are to be intelligent and discerning as a third point, not as a first point. Because if they're not, if they've got personal defects or they are just ugly, no, it doesn't matter if they're smart. We can't have them in front of people. So this is the third priority, that they have intelligence, that they are prudent, not just knowledgeable necessarily, but they are able to discern things. And then fourth, they are also to have ability to serve in the king's court. And so there's a certain sense of decorum that they may have, a certain sense of respectability that they may be able to carry with them. You don't want someone there who is constantly drawing attention to himself. Also, you don't want someone there who is going to mismanage things. And so they need to have ability. Now, we might look at that list and say, okay, there is a certain worldly wisdom in it. We can also be reminded that, or what Scripture says, that the world looks on the outward appearance. And that's ultimately what you have here, right? The world is looking on the outward appearance, and it's valuing that over everything else. And so there's perhaps a lesson there as well, because they are not going to value spiritual values. Well, once these youths are selected, what are they to do? Well, they are to be trained. And the training is to involve literature and the language of the Chaldeans. Now, this is not just Babylon, but the ancient mystery religions, Zoroastrianism, and different things that Babylon would have been built on. Daniel and his friends probably already knew some Aramaic, the language of the day, but they would have to learn the Akkadian letters, which would be little wedge-shaped things that typically was etched into those clay tablets. So if you've ever seen those clay tablets with those little wedge-shaped letters, you're seeing Akkadian letters, and then it was then applied to the Aramaic language. The literature that they had to study would include history. You say, okay, astrology, not astronomy, but astrology. Oh, okay, so a little bit of superstition and other pagan religious practices. So what would that do? That would not only be superstitious stuff, that would challenge their Jewish faith. That would challenge the true faith. Education is a battlefield, and it always has been. Now, learning a science, learning a new language, this isn't wrong. And Christians should not view learning as wrong. We should learn. In fact, we should even learn what the world thinks so that we can accurately communicate with the world. But we also understand that it's the worldview behind the education that matters. If it is a godless worldview, that is where the problem is. Christians must engage the world's ideas critically. Moses did this. He learned from the Egyptians, right? He was trained up as Pharaoh's daughter, or as Pharaoh's son. Ooh, oh, that's a whole other problem right there. That's a whole other problem right there. Excuse me, by Pharaoh's daughter, who took him out of the Nile. Yeah, I'm crossing into what the problem is today. We have to understand what the problem is today. We have to know why people think the way they do, so that we can accurately counter that and say, no, that's not right. It's not right. Daniel did that in Babylon. And of course, eventually what's going to happen? He's going to become the chief of the Magi there. He's going to become the chief of all the wise men. He is going to be the one who's going to tell them the right way to do these things. We glorify God by excelling academically while holding fast to Scripture. We as parents should be pushing our kids to do well academically, as much as our kids may not like that. I didn't like it when I was a kid. I didn't like to be pushed, but it is necessary. It is necessary. And we glorify God when we do that. We glorify God when we seek to learn on our own. When we seek to understand these things, and we seek to bring all thoughts under subjection to Scripture, to Christ. And so we do have to understand that. And pagan society is going to sometimes try to take our kids. Our kids need to know the truth. Pagan society is going to sometimes try to re-educate our kids. They need to know the truth. And that brings us to the third point here. And that is this, that a pagan society sometimes conditions youths. Conditions youths. Now, of course, what kind of conditioning am I talking about? Am I talking about conditioning like physical conditioning? No, I'm not exactly talking about that. Let's read verses 5 through 7. The king appointed for them a daily ration from the king's choice food and from the wine which he drank, and appointed that they should be educated 3 years, and at the end of which they were to enter the king's personal service. Now among them, from the sons of Judah, were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Then the commander of the officials assigned new names to them. And to Daniel he assigned the name Belshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. Abednego. We'll talk about that in just a moment. There's a re-education, of course, happening here. But there's also a wooing that's happening here. Look at what the king is doing. He's assigning them a daily portion of his delicacies, of his good food, the king's meat. And that it's going to be the best, right? uh, you're not exactly getting the Kraft macaroni and cheese out of the cabinet with this one, right? This is going to be 5-star dining every single day. It's going to be good stuff. It's going to be steak. It's going to be lobster. It's going to be, oh, I don't know if they had lobster back then, but it's going to be good food, right? And you're going to be getting good vegetables with it. You're going to be getting good bread with it, and you're going to be getting good wine with it. And so there's a sense in which all of this is like, oh wow, and imagine being someone who's 14, 15, 16. Daniel was probably about 15 or so years old at this point. His friends were maybe a year behind him, and maybe they had some nice things back in Jerusalem, but now they're seeing, okay, no, this is good stuff. This is really good stuff. They could really live it up here, and that can be attractive to young people. Having that kind of influence, having that kind of wealth and luxury, that can be attractive. Now, eventually, of course, we read that Daniel will find this to be defiling. It's defiling, and it's probably because it was sacrificed to idols. But we'll talk more about that next time when we get down to verse 8. But this is a common practice that happened. This happened with Jehoiachin in 2 Kings 25:30. And then, of course, the Persians did engage in what we were talking about here, 3-year education period, so that they could then stand before the king as administrators. The goal is to make the captives dependent upon Babylonian provision and to end their ethnic identity. They are now Babylonians, and that is the idea, to bring them in. Now, the world offers enticing provisions, and that's something that we see. We see wealth, we see status, we see pleasure, we see all these things being presented before us, and it's presented in the world. It's presented in music. It's not just in pop music and worldly music. Some of the things happening in CCM right now, Christian contemporary music, it is so sad and disheartening. That stuff that's coming out about Michael Tate right now, who is formerly DC Talk, now Newsboys. And it's just ugly, and it reveals that there is something deeply wrong there as well, where there can be drugs and alcohol and abuse going just so freely uh, within the Christian music scene. And of course, it's even worse in the world, but really, is there much of a difference at this point as we look at that? There is a lot of things that are offered up, and it is offered up at the cost of compromise. Compromise. All you have to do is compromise your principles. And of course, that's what some of this is always pointed to. You get a 13, 14-year-old in there, and you don't have to wait to drink. Come on, let's have some alcohol together. Let's maybe mix something in with the alcohol. And there's a corruption that happens there. Is it really that much different today than it was back then? This is pagan society. Christians have to be wise and discerning. We have to test things by God's word, and we have to refuse that which defiles, even if it seems beneficial. We have to say, no, I can't. I can't be a part of that. I can't partake. Why? Because we must remain faithful. Thankfully, God does help a remnant remain faithful. And we see a named remnant here in verse 6. We start off with Daniel. And of course, this is the Daniel of the book. Verse 6, we get now down to the Daniel. And his name means God is my judge. God is my judge. Second, we don't have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We have Hananiah, whose name means Yahweh has been gracious. Third, we have Mishael, whose name means who is what God is. It's a question, and it's interesting that a name is a question. Kind of like Micah, we have the same thing there. Who is what God is? That is an important question. Fourth, there's Azariah, whose name means Yahweh has helped. These names reflect their covenant identity with God. They reflect a relationship with God. Hopefully, we name our kids and we think, hopefully, that He will follow along with that. And they do, it appears. These individuals, these young men, represent a faithful remnant. And Isaiah references that in Isaiah 7:3, that God would bring back a faithful remnant. You know, it's easy to assume that you're alone in a pagan culture. But you're not. You're not. God is preserving His remnant. You may not always see them, but God in every generation is preserving His remnant. And so don't give in to feelings of being outnumbered and woe is me. Kind of like Elijah, right? He had that moment, and it's a natural moment, it's a human moment, but it is a moment where you forget the truth of God. There is a remnant. There are those who are still serving God. And God uses ordinary believers to accomplish His purposes. So stay strong, stay faithful, trusting in His plan while keeping an eye open. And you may just find that as you are running toward God in a pagan culture, that there are a few people who are running in the same direction as you. Sadly, the devil behind a pagan culture sees this, and he seeks to remove all references to God. We see that today as we want to see federal buildings scrubbed of references to God, and we need to rewrite the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence because it has references to God. And there's so much. There is a Christian heritage in this country, but it is, of course, being erased as the culture becomes more and more pagan. And that's what the devil likes to see, and he does, of course, want to erase such references. And that brings us to not a brainwashing necessarily, but a name washing. That is what's happening here, which we could argue is a part of brainwashing. Aspenaz assigned each of these four youths new names, much as Joseph faced, right? And in Pharaoh's service, much as Esther faced. What was Esther's real name? That wasn't her given name. Yeah, so I'll leave that to you to look up later. Daniel became Belshazzar. What does that mean? Well, instead of God has judged, it's now protect his life, and perhaps a reference to Bel, the false god of the Babylonians. God protect his life, but the false god Bel, and whose life? Well, the life of the king, the life of Nebuchadnezzar. So now, instead of looking to Yahweh, looking to God, he would be looking to Bel as the idea for power, for strength. Hananiah became Shadrach, which is commanded by Aku, which was the moon god. Mishael became Meshach, which is not, remember, Mishael means who is what God is. Now it's who is what Aku is. You can see this like shoving of pagan deities in there. Azariah becomes Abed Nego, which means servant of Nebo, which is perhaps the god of vegetation, which, I don't know, that just seems a little lame. But it was an agricultural society, or that was a big thing in an agricultural society. But it just seems kind of lame. I've got the god of vegetation. But that is what they were given as far as their names, and they were not so subtle replacements of those things of God with the false gods, of the names of the true God with the false God. It was aimed at stripping away the youth's Jewish identity and identity in the Lord. And this is what pagan culture seeks to do. Now you might say, well, there's not a renaming happening today. Well, certainly in the transgender movement, there is a renaming that is happening today, but that's not the only renaming that's happening in culture. There is also a drive to gain as many labels as possible, or to get labels. I need to go to trained psychologists. I need to look to the DSM-5 and get this label or that label, and I need to be labeled as this. I'm not, or now I'm neurodivergent. Now I'm this. Now I'm that, and there's all this sense of I need to be defined by this label. That's what makes the LGBTQ plus QIA plus whatever community so appealing to some young people, is because they have bought into this notion that they need a label. I've got to have a label on me. And so there's a sense in which, okay, this will give me a label. And maybe I'm wrong about the label, but then I can just trade that out for another label. But I have another label, which is I'm an ally, I'm a this, I'm a that. And there's a sense in which that is appealing to some people. They want to have that naming. And it is a naming by a pagan society. And it's not that some of these labels aren't sometimes useful. I'm not saying that. Don't mishear me. But it is this striving for the labels that can be deceptive. Because labels don't describe the sum total of a person, right? And even if you're dealing with, say, a psychological label, that only gives you a little bit of information about some symptoms that you may be having. Why make that a part of your whole identity? What we as Christians should do is to make our identity Christ. If you want a label, strive for Christian. And make that a good label. Make that a good name to wear as much as you can. Find your identity in Christ. Hold fast to who you are in Him, especially when you are pressured to conform to something else. So we've seen what pagan society can do. And it can be troubling. It can be sobering. So we consider what life in a pagan land is. Like Daniel and his friends, we seek a world that may try to take our kids. We face a world that may seek to re-educate our kids. We seek a world that may seek to condition them and us through free food, free health care, free benefits, this, that. So we face that and we start to open our eyes to that and say, okay, this is an ugly reality. Consider this. This passage also reveals that God is in control over all of that. God is never out of control. And God can be sovereign over what we face. He gave Judah into Nebuchadnezzar's hand, yes, as a punishment. But he also preserved a remnant for his purposes. And he made sure that they had what they needed to have. In the midst of all of this, where Babylon's trying to condition them and give them food to woo them over to their side, they're being fed. They're receiving what they need. They continue their education, even though the education is skewed and against God in many ways. They still are being taken care of. And God is making sure that they have what they need to get to a point where they can then speak for him and proclaim him in that culture. God will preserve his remnant. He will continue to make lights shine in the darkness. And he can make sure that we have what we need, even in a pagan society. And so it's just up to us to live as faithfully as possible, even when the culture around us may become hostile. How do we do that? Well, we do that by trusting in God's plan, by discerning his truth, and by holding fast to our identity in him.